14. Robbing God. Every crime is an offense against God's law order, but certain acts are in particular singled out as especially offensive. One of these is the failure to tithe, which is described as robbing God. Malachi 3, 8-12. Before analyzing the implications of that fact, let us review the basic laws in this area. First, the basic civil tax in Scripture, the only tax, is the poll or head tax, paid by every man 20 years of age and older. Exodus 30, 11-16. The same tax was assessed on all men. The rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less. Exodus 30, verse 15. All have the same stake in justice, and therefore pay the same tax. Second, no man is allowed to tax his own future by means of debt. The length of a debt is limited to 6 years. Deuteronomy 15, 1-4. No man has a right to mortgage his future, since his life belongs to God. Third, the tithe is required of all men. Leviticus 27, 30-32, Numbers 18, 21-28, Proverbs 3, 9-10, 11, 24-25, Malachi 3, 8-12, Matthew 23, 23, 1 Corinthians 9, 12-14, Hebrews 7, 1-8. The regular tithe, 10% of one's income, Deuteronomy 14:22, was then tithed to the priests, who received 10% of the tithe, Numbers 18, 21-28. Thus, the church tithe was a fraction of the total tithe. The poor tithe, paid every other year, Deuteronomy 14:28 and Amos 4:4, alternated with the rejoicing tithe, Deuteronomy 14:22-26, on each 6-year cycle out of 7. Thus, the combined poor tithe and religious tithe averaged out to about 15% per year. Some say 18%. Some of the regular tithe went for Levitical services, to worship, and to music. Much of it went to general social financing, that is, to godly education, and a number of other related services. If this be true, when, then, is the failure to tithe held to be robbing God? The answer is very clear. Without the tithe, a totalitarian state progressively develops to play God over society. With the tithe, the rule of society is restored to God through his ordained tax. A variety of agencies are created by the tithe to minister to the needs of godly society and to provide the needed social financing. The tithe belongs to neither church nor state. It belongs to God, and is to be given by God's people to those who will administer it under God. Its social consequences have been ably described by Ewing. Quote, "If we were living in a theocracy with the divine constitution, the tithe would cover everything. But at present we are living under man-made governments, and man-made governments collect their own taxes. But the tithe still belongs to God. Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Matthew 22:21, Mark 12:17, Luke 20:25, and Romans 13:1-8. The extra tax exacted by governments of our day is the penalty we pay for not accepting God's rule over us nationally. Israel was told of this very thing when she demanded a king to become like other nations, that he would misappropriate the tithe. 1 Samuel 8, 11-18. End quote. In view of the radical implications of the tithe for society, the failure of the church to teach its importance and meaning constitutes a form of robbing God as surely as does the failure to pay the tithe. Another form of robbery against God is the failure to provide for gleaning. According to Leviticus 19, 9-10, total harvesting is prohibited. The poor and stranger are to gain some harvest from the corners of the field or trees. Here again, God has provided a means of social welfare whereby the state is bypassed. Modern urban gleaning includes the work of Goodwill Industries. Even more, it once included all garbage and trash collections by private parties. Paper was bought and reprocessed for use. Rags were important for a variety of uses: garbage for hog feed or for compost, metals for scrap, old bottles for reuse, and so on. Private enterprise made profitable use of trash, whereas today most cities, having made trash collections a socialist monopoly, have mountains of expensively collected trash accumulating and creating major problems. Not too many years ago, trash collection was a business many immigrants entered as poor men and sometimes left as prosperous citizens. Failure to observe the Sabbath years with respect to the land means not only robbing the earth of its rest, but robbing God. Note rightly observed, quote, "The sabbatical year and the year of Jubilee have each in a special way the same theme, the restitutio in integrum, or restoration to an original state." End quote. Restoration is God's purpose, and man is summoned to fulfill, not to impede it. All restoration looks ahead to the times of Jubilee. The times of Jubilee were once basic to Western man's hope and resounded in his song. However misguided, many Civil War soldiers sang songs looking to Jubilee, in the belief that their struggle brought it closer. The Jubilee is referred to in Marching Through Georgia, Kingdom Coming, and other songs of the period. Turning again to the tithe. How the early church understood the tithe is important, in that it is clear that they saw it as a binding law, the purpose of which was broader than the church. Thus, the Apostolic Constitutions says of the clergy, quote, "Let him use those tenths and firstfruits which are given according to the command of God as a man of God, as also let him dispense in a right manner the free will offerings which are brought in on account of the poor, to the orphans, the widows, the afflicted, and strangers in distress, as having that God for the examiner of his accounts, who has committed the disposition to him. Distribute to all those in want with righteousness, and yourselves use the things which belong to the Lord, but do not abuse them." End quote. The Apostolic Constitutions made the bishop and clergy the dispensers of the tithes. With this we cannot entirely agree. However, the important fact is the functions covered by the tithe and gifts in a time of oppression and persecution, and the fact that the tithe was seen as a basic continuing law. A pseudo-Augustinian sermon stated that refusing to tithe is simply theft. Quote, "Whoever will not give the tithe appropriates property that does not belong to him. If the poor die of hunger, he is guilty of their murder and will have to answer before God's judgment seat as a murderer. He has taken that which God has set aside for the poor and kept it for himself." End quote. Another such sermon stated, quote, "Our ancestors had more than they needed because they gave God tithes and paid their taxes to the emperor. However, since we do not wish to share the tithes with God, everything will soon be taken from us. The tax collector takes everything which Christ does not receive." End quote. With Charlemagne, the tithes were made mandatory for all citizens. The Council of Seville, AD 590, had passed a canon ruling that, quote, "If anyone does not tithe everything, let the curse which God inflicted upon Cain for not rightly tithing be heaped upon him." End quote. The state, however, had not yet recognized the social centrality of the tithe. The existence of the tithe made possible the development of religious orders and foundations, which undertook to provide hospitals and medical care, education, welfare, patronage to religious art and music, and a variety of other services. The tithe has functioned where both church and state recognize the principle of the tithe. Since it is a tithe to the Lord, it cannot be restricted to the church or controlled by the state, although both have a right to make it mandatory. The tithe is to the Lord. Thus, in the days of Elisha, a man from Baal-Shalisha brought his tithe to Elisha and his school rather than to the priests, 2 Kings 4:42. In so doing, he was exercising his right to give to that which served the Lord best, rather than to an official but apostate priesthood. The decline of tithing in the 19th and 20th centuries led to a variety of devices for raising funds for churches, Protestant and Catholic, and to a decline in Christian social financing. The result was a shift of power to the state, and also the growth of taxation to remedy the lack of social financing. Without the restoration of the tithe, there can be no restoration of Christian social order, nor can power be restored to the Christian man under God. In quote-unquote reviving tithing, the modern church has personalized the framework. It has referred the promises of Malachi 3:8-12 to the individual. They clearly refer to a national blessing. The tithe creates a radically different social order, and hence a blessing to the nation is spoken of, both as a consequence of tithing and as a result of God's favor. Moreover, the modern church calls for tithing to the church, an erroneous view which cuts off education, health, welfare, and much else from the tithe. Quote-unquote medieval culture saw all these things as a function of the tithe, and when existing orders failed to minister God's gifts properly, new orders arose to receive and administer them. The result was resentment on the part of parish priests, of course, but a healthier social order as well. Tierney's comment on the care of the poor, then, is striking. Quote, "When parishioners who were prepared to bring all kinds of charges against their priests very seldom did raise the issue of the neglect of the poor, the most obvious inference is that it was not a common failing among resident parsons and vicars." End quote. The modern social order robs God by stripping virtually every area from his jurisdiction, from his ordained government and care. Within a generation after the abolition of the legally required tithe in the United States, the state-supported and controlled schools came into existence. Because revivalism and antinomianism led to the decline of the tithe, denounced as legalism and bondage to law, by the beginning of the 20th century, welfare came to be a statist function. A new social order came with the abandonment of the tithe, and the rapid increase of taxes ensued, or statist double and triple tithes and more, to further that new order. Foundations, once an instrument of the Christian tithe, became humanistic social agencies with statist ideals. The city of God was progressively replaced with the city of man. The effective lord of an order is always the essential taxing and tax-collecting power. If the church collects the tax, the church rules society. If the state collects the tax, the state rules society. If, however, the people of God administer the tithe to godly agencies, then God's rule prevails in that social order. In the modern world, the operative God is the state. A final note. Even during the Maccabean period, in spite of the social turmoil, the poor tithe provided for widows and orphans on a regular basis. Then the high priest told him that there was money laid up for the relief of widows and fatherless children. 2 Maccabees 3:10. The total amount available was 400 talents of silver and 200 talents of gold. An age which today both rejects God's order and God's Son as well is surely cursed with a curse and destined for judgment.